Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only three explanations for the accounts of the resurrection: that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. It seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again, the earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ.
Let's start by the resurrection, because I didn't really get to touch on that much in my last rebuttal. You mentioned that the earliest gospel doesn't have any resurrection appearances, and as you acknowledged,
yes.
It says in Mark 16, the angels tell the disciples to go and tells the woman to go tell the disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So there is a implication that there's going to be appearances. Also, 1 Corinthians 15, which is an earlier account, does mention more appearances than any of the Gospels.
500.
Yeah.
Of course, I've always found that quite strange, the reference by Paul there to the appearance to more than 500. This is, I believe, the only account of such an event happening. I wonder kind of who these 500 are, if they ever thought to write anything down, if there's any other account of 500 people having seen this kind of stuff. We're not sure why it is that Paul knows this is the case. He doesn't give an account of where he got this information. It seems to me, at least, plausibly something that could be false, right? It's not, in other words, it's not like extremely well established that Jesus did appear to a group of 500 people.
No, I agree with you. That I don't think the appearance of the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15 is a strong evidential value. It's not a major line of argument for me. I'm just challenging your assertion that there's a developmental trajectory.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, which is fine, of course. You recognise that does exist within the Gospels, the only exception being here one reference by Paul in a letter, which, of course, we've got kind of no actual narration of the appearance. We've just got somebody saying that he's essentially heard that this is something that Jesus had done. Our earliest accounts of an actual narration of Jesus appearing to people don't exist in our earlier sources, except, of course, to the appearance to Paul on the road to Damascus, which would be an example of a group hallucination. But funnily enough, I find this quite interesting, is that it's often said that, well, the disciples couldn't have been essentially hallucinating because of the fact of group appearances. You don't get group hallucinations. But the only early account that we have of a group hallucination, that is the appearance to Paul and his travelling companions, is one in which the companions don't also see the appearance. It's just Paul, which I find quite strange. But I'm dubious of
But
this.
they do have sensory perceptions of the encounter. But be that as it may, I do want to ask about, because coming back to your developmental scenario, Mark, we don't know what he would have gone on to say, because he finishes his account very abruptly. Scholars debate over whether Mark is complete. He intended to finish there, or whether he actually had an ending that subsequently got lost from verse 9 and following. So we don't really know what Mark would have said. And then Matthew and Luke are written approximately around the same time, and Luke doesn't seem to be literally dependent upon Matthew. So really your only data points are Matthew and Luke and John in terms of your developmental trajectory.
Sure, but of course the lack of the appearance narrative in Mark is part of that trajectory. Of course, this could be explained partly by that trajectory, or perhaps by the fact that he did write it and it got lost, or he just decided not to write it, of course. But I'm just kind of using the evidence that's being presented to me here, which are 4 Gospels, the first of which contains no resurrection appearances. And I'm thinking, what might explain the fact that as time goes on, the fancifulness of the stories seems to increase. Indeed, ending in John, the final edition, with the addition of Doubting Thomas, which seems to be a moral lesson against requiring evidence for belief. Of course, after Thomas touches the wounds of Jesus, Jesus says that it's, he now believes, but blessed are those who believe without seeing. He believes because he's seen. Blessed are those who believe without seeing. So what we get is, the further away we get from the actual events that are being reported, the more fanciful the stories, culminating in a story that has a moral lesson advising people that they shouldn't desire to believe on the basis of evidence. This seems to me strange.
So that's not what John's saying there at all. In fact, in the very same chapter, he goes on to say, John, the author goes on to say that these things are written that you might believe that he is the Christ and thus have life in his name. In terms of what he says in verse 29 to Thomas, he's chiding Thomas for not having believed in sufficient evidence because he had the testimony of the other apostles. He'd been with Jesus throughout his ministry and observed the miracles and so forth.
Of course, John is writing at the end of John why he wrote his gospel, but I'm quoting the words of Jesus, right? So there's kind of there's a disanalogy here, or a difference here, which is that Jesus is saying, you believe because you've seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. It's then John who says, oh, but I decided to write this down so that people will come to believe. That it's kind of two separate sources there.
Sure. So, first of all, I gave an explanation for an interpretation of what I think Jesus is saying. And secondly, Jesus, if you look elsewhere, for example, in Matthew 11, when John the Baptist sends disciples to Jesus, are we the one we're expecting, or should we wait for another? He says, well, go back to John, tell him what you hear and see. And talks about the miracles that he's been performing. Right? He talks about the sign of Jonah and his resurrection as being evidence for his incarnation and divine identity.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Is there like a question?
Yeah, so I'm objecting to that particular point that Jesus does seem to affirm approaching this topic evidentially.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. That would be fine. I'd be fine to just kind of drop that point about John, but I'm not really sure if we should.
Okay.
It seems to me that seems to be the most natural reading of doubting Thomas. You're saying that the story should in fact be interpreted as Jesus basically saying, you have believed because you've seen a lot of evidence. Blessed are those who believe having seen sufficient evidence, or something like this?
Yeah, so Thomas was discontent with having sufficient evidence, that he should have believed on the basis of what he already had. And God doesn't take well to people not believing when they've already got sufficient evidence.
Right, I see. That might be plausible. I'm happy to look into it.
The earliest gospel we have, Mark, ends with no appearances of the risen Jesus, just women told he will be seen in Galilee, and they flee in fear, Mark 16:1-8. The later long ending with appearances, Mark 16:9-20, is a known later addition, not in our earliest manuscripts. Then, as time passes, later Gospels add fuller stories, Matthew and Luke, circa 80 to 90 CE, and finally John circa 90 to 110 CE, which is exactly the kind of legendary growth historians expect. Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15, written in the 50s CE, says Jesus appeared to more than 500, but gives no names, place, or narrative, and no other source reports it. Paul also never met Jesus in life and says he received this tradition, so we can't treat it as checked eyewitness history, 1 Corinthians 15:3-8. Claims that groups don't hallucinate, overlook what psychology shows. Grief and expectancy can produce vivid experiences. Studies find 30 to 60% of bereaved people report seeing or sensing a loved one. Memory conformity then spreads and reshapes stories. Even Acts' accounts of Paul's conversion show his companions didn't share his vision, Acts 9:7, 22:9, which matches an internal, personal experience. John's Doubting Thomas ends with, "Blessed are those who have not seen," John 20:29, and the author says he wrote so readers would believe, John 20:31. That's faith-forward theology, not verifiable history. On balance, the earliest evidence fits developing tradition and visionary experiences, not a confirmed physical resurrection.
I did want to ask you, though, about your low intrinsic probability of miracles.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So, can you justify why you come to that conclusion?
I guess the point that I was kind of trying to make there was to say that in the context of this discussion, do you expect a naturalist to take as seriously the hypothesis that a man rose from the dead as he should take the hypothesis that, say, Jesus didn't die or something? Like, in other words, like, I suppose you're not surprised that somebody would not do that, but you're saying that they're being kind of, irrational in doing so?
Correct.
Because in assuming that something like a miracle would have a lower intrinsic probability?
Exactly. So I'm interested in what your justification is for assigning such an intrinsically low probability to miracles.
Wouldn't you say, like, as you said, the fact that this doesn't happen elsewhere would not be a good response, because that's what we'd actually want. This is
that's what
God
we'd expect.
is trying to do. He's trying to put forward a unique event. Could not the same be said that the reason why the resurrection is a powerful vindication of Jesus' message is because it has a low probability of occurring, and so that makes it miraculous that God did it, right? Like, it seems to me that the intuitive force of saying, isn't it amazing that Jesus rising from the dead, isn't it amazing that happened and this vindicates its message, is because of the fact that we should expect this to be so improbable that if it really did happen, this provides strong evidence. And I also wonder if you think that it would provide the same evidence as any other miracle. That is, I don't know why it is that rising from the dead specifically, except maybe the fact that he predicted it, would be any more of indication of his divinity than his ability to turn water into wine. If there was an instance of him having predicted that he would go on to do that and then did that, this seems equally miraculous. This is I don't see why the resurrection in particular would offer a vindication.
Sure. So for a number. Okay, so I'm trying to formulate a question. So Isaiah 53:10, for example, speaks about the resurrection in the context of a messianic prophecy. Jesus himself says that the resurrection will be the vindication of his messianic divine self-claims. And so it's very surprising if God raises Jesus from the dead if he's a false messiah, for example, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense. Yeah. I think that answers it quite well, I think.
Would you also be amenable to the argument that you can bring other arguments to bear independently on Jesus' messianic and divine identity, such as some of the arguments I listed briefly, the trilemma, messianic prophecy, the conversion of Paul, etc., that would be relevant to establishing the prior probability in Jesus' case specifically?
I think you could do, but I don't think that it's been very well done. I don't think the examples that you say, like the trilemma, I don't think that's like good evidence of Jesus' divinity, nor do I think the conversion of St. Paul is particularly strong evidence of Jesus' divinity. I wonder, I know there's only kind of a minute left of your time, but what are the specificities about Paul's conversion that you think bear on the divinity of Jesus?
Sure. I'm trying to formulate questions. This is my question time, so I'm rather than give a statement.
Well, I can ask
sure.
you on the other time if you have anything else you want to say now.
Sure. Okay, so in terms of the argument for intelligent design, would you acknowledge that it's not a God of the gaps argument, that is actually a positive argument?
This is something I was going to ask you about. You said that it's not a God of the gaps argument because it's based on what we do know, and I forget exactly how you argued that case. If you could maybe just do it again briefly.
Yeah, so it's basically that there's a habitual association between information and conscious activity.
Right. Yeah. So I would say, for example, imagine somebody like pre-Newton or something, looking at the orbits of the planets and saying, like, I have absolutely no idea how they're up there, why they're spinning in the way that they're spinning. It must be God. Would you say that is a God of the gaps argument? Mm-hmm. But suppose somebody then said to you, this isn't a God of the gaps argument. This is actually based on what I do know, not what I don't know, which is that there's a habitual association between things that we see moving, that don't stop moving, generally have some kind of agent causing them to continue moving. And so I say that the same thing must be true of the orbs moving in the sky. That doesn't seem to not make it a God of the gaps argument. That seems like just a way of kind of dressing it up.
When we ask how probable a miracle is, start with the base rate. Across billions of human deaths, there are no medically verified cases of a person dead for days returning to normal life. That makes the prior tiny. To overcome a tiny prior, you need multiple, independent, detailed sources written close to the event. Instead, we have anonymous Gospels decades later. Mark around 70 CE, Matthew Luke around 80 to 90, John around 90 to 110, and a brief list in Paul without names or locations. Low prior plus weak, late testimony. Low posterior probability. Appeals to prophecy don't fix this. The verses Christians cite aren't clear predictions of a Messiah rising on the third day. Psalm 16:10 is about David not being abandoned to Sheol. Hosea 6:2 speaks of Israel's restoration. Isaiah 53:10-11 concerns the servant's vindication, not an explicit personal resurrection. These are theological readings after the fact, not straightforward forecasts fulfilled by data. Paul's conversion also fits known visionary experiences. Acts gives inconsistent details about what his companions perceived. Acts 9:7 verses. 22-9, which points to literary shaping, and his companions don't share the vision, consistent with an internal event.
That the naturalist will one day be able to explain and account for DNA replication, then that the theist will ever be able to account for suffering or hiddenness. Indeed, it's usually expected that the theist will never be able to offer such an account. Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only three explanations for the accounts of the resurrection: that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. I would add to this suggestion a fourth, which is that the reports themselves were inaccurately put down into our records. But I think Jonathan more or less addressed that by saying that the gospel writers were fairly scrupulous, and so I think implicitly trying to undermine that example. Now, I admit that some of the hypotheses for explaining what happened on Easter morning are a little bit tenuous. There have been theories that have been suggested and generally rejected by certainly most biblical scholars. For example, the idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen. These kinds of things are usually disproved with fairly intuitive points. That is to say, it seems ridiculous to suggest that Jesus didn't die on the cross. The Romans did know how to kill people, after all, and there would have been various other reasons, which I won't go into now for the sake of time, but I'm sure you're familiar with such a response. But you have to understand the context in which this conversation is taking place. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. But doesn't it seem less plausible yet to suggest that a man rose from the dead? To the naturalist, you can understand why this would seem like quite a leap, unless you've already assumed theism, making the suggestion that this God might have risen Jesus from the dead more plausible than these other explanations. Thinking about the evidence for the resurrection is a complicated topic, but it seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again, the earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ. What we do what the end of Mark's gospel does say is that, there's essentially a prediction. That is, we're told by an angel or presumed angel, that Jesus has gone ahead to Galilee, and you should expect to find him there. And this is where the original manuscript of Mark's gospel ends. Matthew, the next earliest gospel, does contain two appearances, one to the women who visited the tomb on the way to tell the disciples, and then a vision in line with the prediction made in Mark. Now, of course, if this was being somehow forged or something, it seems quite strange, or at least plausible, that this addition could have been made using Mark as a source, which everyone agrees that Matthew does. Luke, later still, contains even more appearances, including like the road to Emmaus. And then John's Gospel, even later still, provides more accounts of appearances, including doubting Thomas, and some other famous examples. I find it a little strange, then, that the further away we get from the origin of the source, the more appearances we see. The earliest Gospel contains no resurrection appearances. The second earliest Gospel does contain one group appearance, but it's exactly in line with what was predicted at the end of Mark. Anyway, this seems a little strange to me. Now, I won't suggest that I could confidently say that these Gospels were forged, or that the writers were mistaken, or that somebody was lying, or that something got miscommunicated. All I'll say is that for the naturalist, these conclusions seem a lot more plausible than the idea that a man might have risen from the dead. I think that's all I've got time for, but hopefully we can speak about St. Paul in a later stage. Thank you.
When Christians argue there are only three options, disciples lied, were mistaken, or were right, we can point out a fourth, that the stories themselves changed as they were written down. This happens all the time in history. Legends grow, details get reshaped, and later writers add material. We see that in the Gospels. Mark, our earliest source, ends with no appearances. Decades later, Matthew and Luke expand the story with appearances, and John, our latest source, adds even more dramatic scenes like doubting Thomas. The further from the events, the bigger the claims. And there are contradictions. Matthew places Jesus' appearance in Galilee, while Luke keeps it in Jerusalem. The number of women at the tomb, the number of angels, and what exactly happens at the tomb all change from gospel to gospel. This is what you expect if stories are developing, not if they're carefully preserved eyewitness reports. From a naturalistic view, ordinary errors, embellishments, and visions are far more likely than one man breaking the universal biological rule of death. If another religion today offered the same kind of evidence for a miracle, would Christians believe it? What do you think? Is the resurrection better explained by faith tradition than by history? Comment below. Let's discuss. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more.
You need to know. The classical, Thomist philosophers will say that God is being itself. God is just being. What the hell does it mean to say that being doesn't exist? What does that even mean? It's like a contradiction.
Because the idea of a judgmental God, a punishing God, a God that is scowling and looking down on us and keeping little marks of what we've done wrong, and that if someone sins or errs, they're going to be cast out or punished or smited or sent to hell or something like that, becomes preposterous.
If people don't understand that so much of what they believe is actually a result of how integrating those beliefs makes you behave and makes you feel. If people think that they're acting purely rationally, that every single decision they make about their worldview and their opinions about the world are purely sort of analytical, syllogistic reasoning, then I think they're either telling the truth, in which case they're missing something incredibly important about the human experience, or they don't realize just how much their emotional states are creeping into their rational thought.
You are infamously began your career on the internet as a new atheist firebrand, kind of the youngest of the lot. And at the same time, you seem to have a almost religious fervor for the Bible and Christianity. What is it that obsesses you about the Bible and the Christian mythology?
The Christians will tell you it's the Christian equivalent of what the Muslims call fitra, the sort of inherent desire or drive that a person is born with towards God, and that I'm being sort of whispered to and through the scripture. I don't think it's that, partly because I'm so critical of the text. It is the only ancient text with which I have enough familiarity to talk about meaningfully. Some people get obsessed with the Odyssey or Metamorphosis or something. And I think part of the interest is, can we be sure that Homer wrote this? Can we figure out why? Can we figure out how people interpreted the story at the time? Did the Greeks really believe in the existence of their gods? These are interesting questions, but questions that I don't really have anything to say about because I don't know their stories very well. With the Bible, I spent so long in the New Atheist school of thinking that religion is harmful and definitely untrue that I learned a thing or two about the Bible.
But even, I would say, more than that, you studied theology.
That's true.
So that's taking a big step other than becoming vaguely familiar with the Gospels.
But there's a level to which, when you are in the New Atheist sort of firebrand spirit, you think, okay, I'm going to learn about this religion because I want to have better discussions and better debates. And then something shifts, and I'm like, look, it's so simplistic to say religion is bad. I think saying religion is bad is like saying politics is bad. Kind of makes sense, and you could make some case. You could give some grand speech saying politics, it drives families apart. And can you name one war that wasn't caused by politics? It's so terrible. And that's kind of true, but it seems trivially true. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a correct political position. And it doesn't mean that you should abstain from doing politics.
Or that humanity needs politics to a certain level, to a certain degree. Exactly. We have to govern and we have to find discourse and ways to legislate.
So I think it's pretty naive. And then I'm left in a position where I no longer think I can make this surface level simplistic firebrand atheist case, but I also am now just really interested in the Gospels. Because once you've spent so long learning about this kind of stuff, when somebody comes along and says, hey, have you ever noticed this about the text? It just is interesting to me because this is something that I've known about for years, and here's something new that I'm discovering. So I just fell into this, I don't know, the only way I can describe it is a bit like how people get interested in all kinds of texts. People have their favorite play or something like that.
I'm going to push back a little bit.
Sure.
I find that a little disingenuous that you're saying the reason I'm interested in the Gospels is it's the thing I'm the most familiar with. I could be familiar with the work of,
In fairness, there aren't like
Zarathustra or the Epic of Gilgamesh or something, but
there aren't world religions that have sprung up that are as relevant to the people I interact with today around something like the
So there's a certain level of relevance to it as well.
Because also, I do philosophy more broadly. I talk about ethics. I talk about free will. I talk about all of this kind of stuff. And in doing that, people always come to the table with religion. It always comes up. You're talking about the big questions with people. Around half of them are probably going to be religious, and some of them are going to be Christian. And I just find these conversations so interesting.
It's fascinating talking about this with you. Really, I'm truly fascinated, and I love getting a non-Christian's perspective on the gospel, because I try and dive in occasionally on my own and understand it, and it's so difficult to separate it from canon.
Yeah, and please take my
interpretation.
words with a pinch of salt.
Sure.
Your listeners should, like, if I've said something that's an egregious error, don't blame Rain. I'm just a guy. I'm just an atheist.
We're
Who's read the
having
Bible.
a conversations. What do I know? I'm just a stupid sitcom actor. But I did want to pick your brain about atheism. And I know right now I would call you kind of a spiritual atheist. Is such a thing possible? Can one be a spiritual atheist?
Sure.
How would that work?
I'm never quite sure what someone means by spiritual. Like, do you mean like has a spirit or believes that?
An atheist that incorporates kind of transcendent emotions into a larger kind of heart-based compassion.
I would say I leave
into their belief structure and way of living.
I leave room for it. I don't believe in anything transcendent of the material, but I haven't like ruled it out, and I'm not a materialist in the sense of saying there is only the material.
Are you now considering yourself an agnostic?
Yeah, I think that's
is that a cop out? A lot of people would say, like, Sebastian Junger came on the show and he's like, it's a bullshit cop out. You're either an atheist or you're a theist. Of course there's an agnostic. We can't know anything. We can't know any truth. What do you think?
Cognitive science has shown for decades that belief isn't purely rational. Daniel Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2, thinking proves that most decisions start with fast, emotional instincts, and then we rationalize them afterward. Religious faith works the same way. It appeals to feelings of comfort and belonging. Neuroscience studies even show that prayer and worship activate the brain's reward system, releasing dopamine, which reinforces belief whether or not it's true. History backs this up too. Christianity itself absorbed myths and customs from earlier religions. Christmas falls near the Roman festival of Saturnalia, and the story of a dying and rising savior parallels older myths like Osiris and Mithras. Even within the Bible, contradictions reveal human authors, not divine truth. The Gospels can't agree on Jesus' genealogy, Matthew 1 versus Luke 3. Luke 3, or what happened at the resurrection. So Alex is right. Our worldviews aren't cold logic. They're shaped by emotional and cultural forces. That's why Christianity spread, not because it proved God exists, but because it resonated with human psychology and borrowed from traditions that came before. Once you see that, it's clear belief is about human needs, not divine truth.
Well, I've heard people say that, and usually it's an atheist of the type of Christopher Hitchens who wants to say that, agnostics are just atheists without a backbone or something. It's like, okay, man, I still don't know if God exists. Like, that is just true. I don't know. It would be maybe a cop-out if I was intentionally, like, calling myself one just for, like, better PR or something. But if anything, it has the opposite effect, because I get a lot of flack for not being too, firm in a position. As I like to say, I will die on this fence. I think it is the most reasonable position to hold, especially because there are so many levels to agnosticism. It's like, okay, is it that you don't know? Is it that you think that it's unknowable? Because it could be that, like, I'm agnostic about whether it's raining outside. Yeah. But I believe we could go and find out with a little bit of effort if it's raining outside. But there's a kind of agnosticism which says you can't know. Right? So I could be an agnostic in the sense, like, my some random uncle of mine or something who's never really thought about theology would probably say, if I were to ask, like, yeah, I guess I'm an agnostic, I don't know. But that's just because, I haven't looked at the arguments. If I have a look, I'll figure it out. There are others who have studied all of the arguments, still say they're agnostic, but because they think you won't be able to get to an answer, right? And it's a difference saying, I just don't know and I can't know. But there's also an agnosticism that comes about as not knowing what someone's talking about. Do you believe in God? Oh, I was like, what do you mean by God? What do you mean by God? Really? It's that annoying Petersonian question, but you need to know. The classical, like, Thomist philosophers will say that God is being itself. God is just being. What the hell does it mean to say that being doesn't exist? What does that even mean? It's like a contradiction. But if you think that God is just being, then you could, as an atheist, be like, yeah, okay, well, I believe that stuff exists, and I guess that makes me a pantheist or something. And it all starts getting muddy and confused.
Sure.
So it's like, okay.
We talked about this before in the limitations of language.
Yeah, it's like ask me, like define the thing you want to know if I believe in, and ask me if I believe in it, and I will tell you to the best of my ability whether I can or I can't. But if somebody says that agnosticism is just a cop-out, well, I think that's a rhetorical cop-out. I think they're just sort of saying something that's a bit sort of spicy and fun and makes you sound like an edgy atheist, but is actually indicative of either not understanding or purposefully misrepresenting the position of the agnostic.
Now, you said before that you don't believe in anything beyond the material. And in our previous conversation, I described kind of my definition of God as being much more akin to something like beauty or truth or even love. Have you ever been in love?
Yeah.
You've been in love. You've felt deep love for a partner, a romantic partner?
Yeah.
And have you felt it for a family member?
Yeah. I mean, one always wants to say, I think so, because I imagine that, for example, when you have a child for the first time, and yeah, that's the problem, isn't it?
Okay.
But I can kind of imagine
think that you have felt love, but you don't know that you've felt it on the kind of a level of like having a child or something like that.
That's what I mean. It's like, I'm sure that when you have a child, it
changes the paradigm.
I had a Christian friend who recently had a child and said that having a child made them suddenly understand not the sacrifice of Jesus as sacrificing himself, but the sacrifice of the Father sacrificing his only son. He was like, I've just unlocked this whole new understanding of what it means to love a son that you've
I had a new understanding of God and the divine when I had a child. I didn't have it. My wife had it, and my wife and my child almost died in childbirth. And it was a horrific story, and it was in the middle of the night and in a hallway in the emergency room in a hospital in Van Nuys, California. It was utter childbirth nightmare that I wouldn't wish on anyone. Everyone survived. It came out great. And I held my son in one of the most profound moments of my life in this hallway at 4 a.m., having him almost die and being brought back from death. And there I was, and I looked him in the eyes, and I felt a kind of love on a level that I had never experienced before. And it made me understand God in a different way, because the idea of a judgmental God, a punishing God, a God that is scowling and looking down on us and keeping little marks of what we've done wrong, and that if someone sins or errs, they're going to be cast out or punished or smited or sent to hell or something like that, becomes preposterous.
Yeah.
Because when you love this child so much, of course there are consequences to behaviors. You know, when my son did some nefarious activities here and there in his teenage years, there were consequences to it, but the love never wavered. And the idea of some kind of like undying punishment from me to this beautiful little creature that had come into the world was beyond the possibility. And then I'm just a unemployed sitcom actor with a mediocre podcast. What do I know? Let alone the divine being, Father, creator of love itself. How much love, how much intimacy, closeness, and light does this, this essence hold us all? The idea of like some kind of punishment or smiting then just becomes ludicrous. So it did, for me, shift my my perspective of the divine. Does that make sense?
And there are things which experience gives you that you just can't quite put into words. I mean, William James famously tried to sort of analyze what religious experience is, and he comes up with these, I think there are like 4 qualities, and one of the qualities of religious experience is its ineffability, that you cannot put it into words, that you can't explain it. It's something that you literally just can't explain. It's like taking psychedelics, right? If you take psychedelics, and you try to explain what it's like, you can kind of get halfway there, but there is a kind of knowledge that consists in experience.
I heard in an interview that you did, and I was listening to a clip of it, and you were talking about, like, imagine someone trying to write an essay about the color blue.
Yeah.
You could know little bit, it could give you some clues into the color blue, but if you'd never seen color before and you grew up in a gray room or you were colorblind or whatever, and all of a sudden you had access to color, seeing the color blue is a very different experience than reading about the color blue.
Yeah, this is a thought experiment called Mary's Room. So you imagine Mary in this room, but you can make it even worse because you can say, imagine that Mary in this black and white room that she's born in has access to everything that ever even could be written or uncovered or understood about the color blue. All the science that we yet to discover, all the color theory, everything that could even be known. She has it all written down, she studies it all. And then she steps outside and she sees something blue. The question is, does she learn something? And it seems like the answer is yes. And if that's the case, then there is a kind of knowledge that consists in experience.
When Alex says he'll die on the fence as an agnostic, he's actually pointing to one of the strongest philosophical positions. We don't know, and maybe we can't know. Even Thomas Huxley, who coined the term agnostic in the 19th century, argued that intellectual honesty requires admitting limits to human knowledge. Science supports this. The Mary's Room thought experiment in philosophy of mind shows that no matter how much you know about an experience, you can't fully understand it without living it. That doesn't mean the supernatural is real. It just means human brains process knowledge differently when tied to emotion and perception, and religious experiences don't prove a God. Neuroscience shows that love, awe, and mystical states all arise from brain activity. Experiments with psychedelics like psilocybin reliably trigger feelings of unity, transcendence, or divine presence, the same sensations people attribute to God. In fact, Andrew Newberg's brain scans of praying nuns and meditating monks revealed predictable neurological patterns, not evidence of heaven. Even the Bible contradicts the idea of an all-loving God revealed through experience. Exodus 34:7 describes God punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Compare that to Jesus' teaching of unconditional forgiveness, and you see human authors projecting different experiences of love, fear, and control, not a consistent divine truth.
When that is best.
And love is like that.
And that points us to love, because I think that love is the greatest kind of analogy to God. And you said, I don't believe in anything kind of transcendent beyond the material. Do you believe that love is merely kind of neurons and endorphins in the brain, united with some kind of DNA kind of like impetus towards propagation of the species?
Now, that's a genuine mystery, because I think that's tied up to the question of consciousness more broadly. I don't have any problem saying that the experience of love is something like a feeling. It's something that you very strongly feel. And so if you're going to be a materialist about consciousness in general, you can say that love is just one of those feelings that is neurons in the brain. But not specific to love, just specific to feeling anything. I find it very strange to say that not that the feeling of love or the seeing of blue is correlated with brain activity, but that is the brain activity. That love is the same thing as the neurons firing in my brain when I feel love. I'm not interested in what the brain's doing. I'm interested in the experience that correlates with that brain activity. You know, if the experience of seeing blue is just neurons firing in my brain, if that's what blue is, I should be able to cut open your brain and find blue in there somewhere, but you can't. There's something called blue, this experience that you have, which goes alongside the brain activity, but is not the same thing as it. That is the greatest mystery for materialists to explain, which is why I'm agnostic. That's why I say I leave room for this. I don't say I'm a materialist. The biggest challenge for that is consciousness.
Well, one of the biggest disservices that atheists, I feel, do to themselves and to their cause, because atheists can be extremely evangelical, is this idea that consciousness is an illusion. You know, it's the Daniel Dennett kind of thing. Like we're getting all of these inputs, and our brain makes them become a totality of experience, but it's all illusory, including emotion. And that free will is also an illusion, but that, you know, between our DNA and between our neurons firing and our background and our B.F. Skinner kind of behavioralist way that we've grown up in our culture, you know, any choice that we're seeming to make has actually been pre-wired into our cognition. But if atheists hold to consciousness is an illusion and there's no such thing as free will, you're not going to gain a lot of converts. Because if you go to a random house over here in Thousand Oaks, California,
Have you heard the bad news?
like, hey, by the way, guys, your experience of being a human being, memories and growing up and falling in love and breaking your leg and losing your uncle and seeing the Mona Lisa for the first time. By the way, that's all an illusion.
Yeah.
And in fact, you didn't even really experience that. And you didn't even choose to go to Italy and go see the Mona Lisa. That was all chosen for you in a variety of different ways. You're not really doing yourselves any favor by gaining people over to the atheist bandwagon.
The few issues I'd have to raise to that, though, are firstly that truth doesn't have to be palatable, right? If it is actually the case, you might not have many converts to it, but if it is the case, then it just is the case. Also, some people will say that
Christians would say the same thing.
That's true, but that's the thing.
Burning in hell may not be palatable, but it doesn't convert people, right? Exactly. But it's true.
And so I think, the kind of atheist materialist you're talking about would say the same thing. Technically speaking, you don't have to be a materialist to be an atheist, because atheism is being without God.
Yep.
You could believe that there's an immaterial existence. You could believe in mind-body dualism, but not believe that there's a God, for example. That's another important thing to spell out. But yeah, I mean, the idea that consciousness is an illusion, I think, is pretty confused. Having said that, I haven't thought about this as much as Daniel Dennett has, so I have to temper my words. But I really think that that's almost a contradiction in terms. There's also another sort of element that's missing from this picture. We talk about there only being the material, or there being the material, but also this like mind stuff, this immaterial thing. There's also a position that there's only the mind stuff and that the material doesn't exist.
Oh, that's good. I know my friend Stephen Phelps is out there watching, and he's all in favor of that.
Yeah.
Right? You lit up like a Christmas tree. He's so happy right now.
So they call it idealism, at least in one of its forms.
Okay, I hadn't heard of that.
So it's kind of mysterious how materialists account for consciousness, but they say, like, in some way, the conscious experience is just emergent of material properties. And the idealist says that the material world is emergent of a mind. So George Berkeley is sort of the classic philosopher to think about here. He starts by sort of asking the reader to be like, it's impossible to separate the thing from your idea of the thing, right? Like if you try to imagine a tree that's just on its own somewhere in a forest, you've got the concept in your mind. The thing that's in your mind is the concept of the tree. It's not you don't have a material tree in your mind. It's the concept. And like your sense experience, you're only seeing a representation of what's in front of you.
Is that kind of like Plato's forms, like the ideal form?
Plato is sort of abstracting from objects to understand why this is a cup and that's also a cup. What is it they have in common? They're far apart from each other. They're different colors. They're different shapes. What is it they have in common? Well, they both share in this abstract thing called a form. That's a whole other thing, which I also think kind of maybe points to consciousness, but that's really interesting. But no, Berkeley is talking about you can't think of a thing without thinking of the thing, right? Nothing exists except insofar as it's being thought about. Now, I think there are so many holes to poke in this, but this is Berkeley's position. So he's like, when you see a table, you're just seeing your mind's representation of the table. You don't see the table directly. Same thing like Kant points out, you don't have direct access to the table. It's through your experience. Okay, well, the same thing with anything, and the critic says, well, I can conceive of a cup just existing on its own. And Berkeley's like, yeah, but you're conceiving of it. And so what you're imagining is a thought. So here comes the objection to this position. Aha, okay, well, Mr. Berkeley, if I have a candle and I light the candle and I look at it and then I leave the room and I don't think about it, no one's thinking about the candle, and yet I come back and the candle has melted. There must have been a time in between where the candle existed, but no one was thinking about it. So it existed separate from thought. And Berkeley says, I still think that things only exist insofar as they're being thought about. But what you've just proven is that there is always some kind of mind thinking about everything all at once.
Ooh.
And that's what God is for George Berkeley.
Interesting.
So Berkeley thinks that God exists and the entire material universe is like a thought of God, which is kind of interesting. The Plato's form thing is interesting because there is this great mystery. Why is this a cup? Why is that a cup? Why is this a table and this not a table? It's actually a really difficult question to answer.
When people say love proves God, they're confusing emotion with evidence. Neuroscience is clear. Love is a product of brain chemistry. Oxytocin, dopamine, and vasopressin drive bonding between partners, parents, and children. These chemicals evolved to help humans survive and pass on their genes, not to reveal the divine. The fact that we feel love so powerfully doesn't mean it comes from outside the material. It means our brains are wired for it. Consciousness is often called the hard problem, but that mystery doesn't point to God either. Philosophers like Daniel Dennett and Patricia Churchland argue that consciousness emerges from complex neural networks, just like flight emerges from wings. We don't need a supernatural soul to explain experience. And history shows that claims about consciousness as proof of God shift with time. Augustine said it was the soul. Descartes said it was dualism. Today, neuroscience shows its electrochemical activity. Each step shrinks the role of God. Even Berkeley's idea that the universe only exists because God is thinking it falls apart. Physics shows the universe operated for billions of years before humans, or any minds, were here to perceive it. Cosmic background radiation, fossil records, and planetary evolution all prove that matter existed long before thought. So love, consciousness, and philosophy don't point to God. They point to the complexity of the human brain. The beauty of agnosticism and atheism is that it allows us to admit what we don't yet know without inventing a supernatural answer. What do you think? Does love prove God? Or is it just chemistry and evolution? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this gave you perspective, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into philosophy, science, and belief.
Do they just mean in terms of the state of your eternal soul? So like the doctrines that you believe are leading you to hell? Or do they actually believe that they're a force for evil in the world? Like they do evil things that make people's lives worse in the world?
If you don't have a proper theology, then you go to hell. Like you can be a wonderful Latter-day Saint who not only who professes faith in Jesus Christ. Like I will tell people right now, I have placed my faith entirely in the Lord Jesus Christ as my Savior. He is my Savior and my Redeemer. But they say, yeah, but you have the wrong, you're worshiping the wrong Jesus because I reject the Trinitarian formulation of God.
I did see Matt Fradd of Pints with Aquinas. You had a debate with Trent Horn.
Yes.
About Mormonism on Pints with Aquinas. I've been on that show too. Matt does quite well as a podcaster. I think his channel's growing. He's a competent interviewer.
Yeah,
I did see him say that if he was walking down the street and he saw a Book of Mormon in one of those like community libraries, you know, like where you can sort of take a book and leave a book, that he would take it out and throw it in the trash, and sort of also defended.
He would burn it.
So he was defending the idea of burning Books of Mormon, and that if he saw one in the community library, he thinks it's okay to take it out and throw it in the trash. And the reason I bring that up is because, I mean, that was in a way offensive to me, just as somebody who is naturally shaken by the thought of burning at least most books. I was asked in a Q&A recently whether it's ever okay to burn books, and if we're going to be pedantic, trivially, yeah, if there was a book that contained the nuclear codes or something like that, you know, fine. But in this case, I was a little bit disturbed. And the reason for this is because these Christians see it as false doctrine. They see it as, you know, misleading people to have a wrong view of Christ. So when you say that people think that Christians think Mormons are, you know, dangerous, do they just mean in terms of the state of your eternal soul? So like the doctrines that you believe are leading you to hell? Or do they actually believe that they're a force for evil in the world? Like they do evil things that make people's lives worse in the world?
I would say it's more theological for sure. But it also, their idea is that if you don't have a proper theology, then you go to hell. Like you can be a wonderful Latter-day Saint who not only who professes faith in Jesus Christ. Like I will tell people right now, I have placed my faith entirely in the Lord Jesus Christ as my Savior. He is my Savior and my Redeemer. But they say, yeah, but you have the wrong, you're worshiping the wrong Jesus because I reject the Trinitarian formulation of God. That's why the Catholic Church will recognize, for example, the baptisms done by Protestants, but they won't recognize Latter-day Saint baptisms, even though we literally baptize in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. But because we mean something differently about the ontological status of those three persons, well, that's enough to say it doesn't count. And
sure. Now,
and so that's, see, where we speak though, and so for a lot of people, for an atheist, we're just sort of a sociological phenomena that's interesting to look at. But
right.
For a Christian, they have to consider a lot of other factors here. is this a live option? C.S. Lewis, for example, he has this wonderful analogy of mere Christianity being like this house. And he says that in this house, you don't live in the halls, right? Where, you live in one of the rooms in one of the denominations. He said, I have a quote here. He says, "It is in the rooms, not the hall, that there are fires and chairs and meals. The hall is a place to wait in, a place from which to try the various doors, not the place to live in." And so for somebody like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who finds herself as sort of a mere Christian, there's this question, are you Catholic? Are you Protestant? Are you Orthodox? But what if you're not satisfied with any of those options? I think this is where the restored gospel really has something to say that is really fascinating to people. And a lot of people, they jump right to sort of the Joseph Smith story. And I always tell people, look, the Joseph Smith story, which we'll get into, it's the second half of the play. It's Act 2. And if you don't understand what happened in Act 1, Act 2 will make no sense, right? And so the first part of this story starts long before Joseph, and it's really, when you find out what we say in this first part, this is really what fires up sort of the creedal Christian tradition, right? And so if you want, we can kind of start going into
which I do love to do, yes. I mean, I think we, there's a lot I want to cover, and I want people to bear in mind that if they're listening to this, I want to give you space to sort of talk about what Mormons believe. I want to get some theological ideas. I want people to understand what Mormonism actually is. Because even now, after listening to us talk for 15 minutes, they might be like, I still don't know what this is, what makes it different. I want to give you the space to do that. We are going to discuss some criticisms. We're going to talk about the Book of Abraham. We're going to talk about black people in being allowed into the temple. We're going to talk about polygamy. We're going to talk about these things. But I'm not going to, come out of the box with those things. So, and of course, you need to have some understanding about what Mormonism is for that to make any sense. So, if you think it's most appropriate to start with the story of Mormon, then we can do that.
Yes, I think that's probably the best way to start with this. So, the first part is to understand. There's a question that I like to ask. And this goes way before Joseph Smith, and that is, why does the God of Aristotle sound exactly like the God that emerged in the creedal tradition? Okay. Aristotle's God is this unmoved mover, pure actuality, being itself. To quote our friend Dr. Craig, he's timeless, spaceless, immaterial.
Yeah.
Right? Without passions, without parts, without change. Now, if you were to just go read the Bible, is that what you'd come up with? Like, when you read the Bible straight up, God is no passions? Like the Old Testament, God, no passions, really? Christ rises from the dead with a physical body? How do you reconcile that with this idea of an immaterial God? And so what a lot of people don't realize was that this is the problem, in my opinion, with the creedal tradition. They start by saying, well, what are we talking about? We're talking about God. Well, what is God? Well, God is that which no greater can be conceived. In other words, they aren't going to Jesus and saying, what is God? They're using a philosophical frame that goes back to the Greeks of perfect being theology. And they're saying, this is what we mean by God. And then they're trying to reason back to basically apply that lens to the Bible as the lens of interpretation. Right? So they're not looking at
Scripture for their basis of their idea of God, but rather using the light of natural reason, essentially.
Absolutely. So, and what it is, and then their God, this is what biblical scholarship is revealing more and more, that the conception of God in things like the Old Testament, it wasn't even hard monotheism. Like in the creation account, they're talking about man has become as one of us. Wait, what? Now, a plain reading of the text, you're going to say there are some sort of divine beings involved here, and there's a council of gods. There's all sorts of things that when you look at the biblical scholarship, you realize that this hard, abstract monotheism is a later creation. And even worse than that, it doesn't jive with the embodied, resurrected Jesus.
When critics call Mormonism dangerous simply because it rejects the Trinity, that actually exposes a deeper problem. The Trinity itself isn't in the Bible. the word never appears, and the doctrine was only finalized at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, centuries after Jesus. Early Christians disagreed sharply on God's nature, and historians like Bart Ehrman note that doctrines were shaped as much by politics and philosophy as by Scripture. Even the Old Testament shows traces of a divine council, not strict monotheism. In Genesis 1:26, God says, "Let us make man in our image." And in Psalm 82:1, God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. That's a far cry from the abstract, passionless God described later by theologians under Greek influence, like Aristotle's unmoved mover. Science also tells us belief systems evolve to meet social needs. Sociologists like Rodney Stark have shown that religions adapt their doctrines over time to gain authority and control followers. Mormonism is just one more example, redefining God's nature to fit Joseph Smith's vision. But the Christian rejection of Mormon baptisms as invalid highlights the irony. Both faiths are built on human reinterpretation layered onto ancient texts. The evidence, historical, biblical, and sociological, shows that these doctrines aren't eternal truths, but human inventions.
I want people to know as well that these are ideas that are not, strictly speaking, Mormon. I know you haven't claimed that that's the case, but the idea of monotheism developing over the course of the history of Judaism and not being present from the start. I did an episode with Dr. Justin Sledge from Esoterica on the origins of Yahweh as a god, and we talked about this, where monotheism came from. And so I just want people to be aware that this isn't just like some weird Mormon interpretation of the Bible. This is something that people do say. For instance, the "thou shalt have no other gods before me," a lot of people interpret that to not be monotheistic, but henotheistic. And henotheism is the view that there are lots of gods, but only one of them should be worshipped, which is a kind of de facto monotheism, but is not quite the same thing. And yes, you've mentioned the Council of Gods, mentioned famously in the book of Job, or the Divine Council in the book of Job. And God has a council in the Psalms as well, where he refers to other people as gods. It's all a little bit strange. So that stuff really is in there, and that's not just a Mormon thing.
Yeah, and what people don't realize is that the Christians of the first century, and even the Jews, had been deeply Hellenized in their intellectual traditions. And so Jesus comes in, and he actually is a big problem because he rises with a body. And this really matters because for the next few centuries, you have what are known as the great Christological debates of the early church, where everyone is trying to figure out, what are we to make of Jesus? Now, there's a funny thing, Alex. You and I in the Jubilee debate, one of the topics we debated is Jesus never claimed to be God. Yeah, now, here's a little funny thing about that. There's a sense in which it depends on what you meant by God. Yeah. If you are meaning the abstract conception of the hard monotheistic creedal tradition, I would say, yeah, no, Jesus didn't ever claim to be that. He did claim to be a divine being. And so I thought that was kind of funny, but it's important to remember that there's this conflict. It's the same problem in a sense that we have today. There's this sort of abstract notion of God that someone like Jordan Peterson will talk about, the highest value. And he's talking in Platonic ideas, right? Very Greek in the way he's thinking about it. But then you're over there going, yeah, but did Jesus actually rise with a physical body out of that tomb, right? That is the essence of the same debate that was going on in the early church. And so being Hellenized sort of people in the Greek world, they began to approach this debate using a Greek sort of lens of actuality, potentiality, impassibility, all this kind of stuff. And this is totally foreign to like the world of Jesus and what he taught. You go to the Sermon on the Mount, and it's this law of conduct. It assumes beliefs. It doesn't formulate them. It belongs to the ethical, not this sort of speculative side of theological stuff. One is something you'd hear amongst Jewish peasants. The other is, from the world of Greek philosophers. And in the early church, there was no central, originally there was an adjudicating authority, right? Like when they had the question about circumcision, well, there was a central authority in the apostles, like Peter, who kind of settled the question. But in the years following the death of the apostles, there were kind of these different local leader groups, and there were different ideas and different Christian traditions. And I know that you are familiar with that as you've studied some of early Christian history. Like, it is not a super, like, there was one group that was just, this is the official church. It was a much more diverse movement.
What's important here is that Jacob is right about one thing. These ideas aren't uniquely Mormon. Modern scholarship shows that Judaism wasn't originally monotheistic. In Exodus 23, "You shall have no other gods before me," the wording only makes sense if people believed in other gods. It's henotheism, devotion to one God among many. The divine council passages make this even clearer. Psalm 82:1 says, "God presides in the great assembly. He gives judgment among the gods." The book of Job also describes the sons of God gathering around Yahweh. That's not strict monotheism, that's a pantheon. Historically, early Christians and Jews were shaped by Greek philosophy, not just scripture. Once Jesus enters the picture with claims of divinity and stories of resurrection, it created a crisis. Did he mean God in the sense of the Greek unmoved mover, or something else entirely? The Gospels don't show Jesus claiming to be that abstract deity. Instead, teachings like the Sermon on the Mount are ethical instructions, not metaphysical formulas. The Christological debates that followed, stretching from the 2nd to the 5th centuries, were essentially arguments about how to fit Jesus into a Greek framework of divinity. Councils like Nicaea and Chalcedon were political as much as theological, and there was no single official church in those early years. Christianity was fractured, diverse, and constantly reinventing itself. That shows us these doctrines aren't eternal truths handed down from God. They're human constructs shaped by culture, philosophy, and power struggles.
Yeah, people will dispute the extent to which that is the case. The fascinating thing with the discovery of the Gnostic Gospels in the Nag Hammadi library was this indication that the early Christian movement was a lot more, there was a lot more variance. I mean, we knew that these ideas existed, of course, but we didn't have the actual texts themselves. And it sort of became increasingly clear. I think Elaine Pagels, who I've had on the show, had a lot to do with this. Her book, The Gnostic Gospels in the 70s, sort of proposed this idea that it's not a homogenous early Christian community, but like this fledgling Jesus movement that has lots of different strands. The interesting thing about, I think you're right that the philosophy of religion is quite divorced from the Bible, in the sense that if you ask a biblical scholar, you know, what is contingency, they might have no idea, and they have no need to know either. But I think that the philosopher will be listening to this and saying, that's all very well and good, but philosophy is more fundamental, right? Like if something by the light of reason just leads you into a conclusion, like that there must be a unified first cause that is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. If that is just logically true, no matter what, then you have your Christian revelation. You have to make the Christian revelation fit the more foundational philosophical certainty, rather than abandoning the philosophical certainty for what is essentially your interpretation of a text, right? So people will think that you're sort of doing it the wrong way around, in other words.
Yeah, and that is exactly the argument of sort of the early leaders and early philosophers. And my whole point, though, is just to recognize that that's what they're doing. They're not going to the text of the Bible and saying, this is what the Bible obviously says. They're starting with a preconception for what God is, arrived purely through reason rather than through revelation.
Yeah.
And so this is a big deal to Latter-day Saints. In fact, from the very beginning, there's and I think that I think perfect being theology leads you to absolute incoherence, and it's incompatible with the Bible. One of our early church leaders, I think he summed it up really well. He was talking about these different theories about God and the creeds, and he says that the language amongst these theories runs like this. He says, there is only one living and true God without body, parts, or passions consisting of three persons. And he goes on to say this. He says, it's painful to the human mind to be compelled to admit that such wonderful inconsistencies of language or ideas have ever found place in any human creed. Yet so it is. It is but another way of saying there is a God who does not exist, a God who is composed of non-entity, who is the negative of all existence, who occupies no space, exists in no time, who is composed of no substance, known or unknown, and who has no powers or properties in common with anything or being known to exist. Such a God could never be seen, heard, or felt by any being in the universe. And that last line, I think he's sort of paying homage to the interaction problem, right? Mm-hmm. If this God is totally other than the created order, how does he interact with the created order in any way? So these are ideas that for Latter-day Saints, we look at this and we go, something happened here. And what it really comes down to historically is that there was no central authority. An analogy I like to use is like a mirror that fell and broke. And the Gnostics, for example, I think they picked up part of the mirror. They had something there. They're missing a ton, and I would say that the Gnostics are wrong, but they had something. And the creedal tradition that emerged, I would say, was actually probably the biggest piece of the mirror. I don't want to go too hard against the creedal tradition because I actually believe that they are kind of they got the biggest piece. But without this central sort of adjudicating authority, it's all kind of a mess until Constantine adopts this divided movement as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so now as the official religion, you have to have an official, what do we believe? What is within the bounds of orthodoxy and what is outside the bounds of orthodoxy? This is where the creeds come from. They begin centuries after Jesus, and they begin as a orthodoxy test. Now, there were creeds that they talk about that were before, but Latter-day Saints don't really have problems with, the Apostles' Creed that says, Jesus died and resurrected. It's more the later creeds that begin to change this notion about the identity of who God is, right?
Just a point of pedantry, I think, because this is said a lot. I think it is Constantine who made Christianity legal in the Roman Empire, but Theodosius, who 10 years later made it the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Okay, and that
matters here, but to be honest with you, it saves that line of critical commentary. You know what I mean?
You're right. And if I make little slip-ups, just know people I'm doing my best here, and I may misspeak occasionally on little things.
It's just one of those. It's one of those huge factoids that gets said all the time because he made it legal. I think it's Richard Dawkins has it in his book, in Outgrowing God, and it's just seems to have become true, I suppose. But no, I think that's the case.
Speaking of things becoming true, here's what's interesting, just historically speaking. The great Christological debates were never resolved. Instead, a particular take on the Christological debates was enforced. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you were outside of the orthodoxy of the official church of the Roman Empire, the official religion, then you were a heretic, not just in a vague sense, you were against the official church. And this creedal tradition, it didn't really spread because it just made so much sense. It wasn't they went to people and were like, oh, hypostatic union. And they're just that makes total sense. Trinity, perfect. The reason that it spread was because it was the official religion of governments that for 1,500 years had adopted this sort of creedal tradition as their official, orthodoxy. And then as they expand, well, this is our religion, right? And so essentially for 1,500 years, this creedal tradition spreads around the world and is enforced through the state. And it's funny because to this day, it's still not enforced through argument. It's enforced through sort of social pressure. For example, you were on Ruslan's podcast, and as soon as you mention Latter-day Saints, what's the first thing he says? He says, they're not Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? What he's doing is he's saying, why aren't we Christian? You want to know why he say we're not Christian? It's not because we don't accept the New Testament or believe that Jesus rose from the dead. It's because we don't accept the Trinitarian formulation of God. which is demonstrably a formulation that came through the creeds centuries after Christ.
I'm sure if Ruslan were asked that, and I'm sure he's setting up a live stream as we speak to respond.
I'm perfectly happy to talk with him about this, by the way.
He might say, like, yeah, but it's not just like, well, I'm a Trinitarian and I've decided that, and that means you don't count. But rather, I have good reasons to think that Christianity requires the Trinity, that you have to believe in the Trinity in order to be a Christian. And so when I say that you're not a Christian because you don't believe in the Trinity, it's a shorthand for saying you're not a Christian because you don't align with what I consider to be fundamental to Christianity for good philosophical reasons, not just because it's decided by some ancient doctrine.
What the Nag Hammadi discoveries showed us is that early Christianity was never unified. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip reveal whole strands of Jesus followers who interpreted him in radically different ways. Elaine Pagels and other scholars made it clear decades ago the Orthodox version of Christianity wasn't the only one. It was just the one that gained political power. When Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, and Theodosius made it the state religion in 380 CE, doctrine stopped being about truth and started being about control. The Trinity, the hypostatic union, and the creeds weren't embraced because they made sense. They were enforced by imperial authority. For 1,500 years, those creeds spread because they were backed by the state, not because they reflected what Jesus taught. And this is the critical point. When you read the Bible itself, you don't find Greek philosophy. You don't find abstract terms like immutability or perfect being. You find a very human God, jealous in Exodus 34:14, sitting in council in Psalm 82, even walking in the garden in Genesis 3. The later picture of a spaceless, timeless, immaterial God was a philosophical invention. That means when Christians say Mormons aren't real Christians because they reject the Trinity, they're actually appealing to a man-made formula, not the words of Jesus or the earliest followers. So here's the question. If Christianity's core doctrines were built by councils, emperors, and philosophers centuries after Christ, why should we trust them as eternal truth? What do you think? Are these doctrines human inventions or divine revelation? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives.